Well, welcome to section 3 of the course, in which we look at what are we looking at? Let's think about what we did, or we looked at in section 2. There was a divide there between Epicurus on the one hand, who believes really that death is the end, the absolute termination, the annihilation of the person as a whole. That is, that there is nothing left of us after death, and if that's not true, then Epicurus's whole notion of death falls apart. And on the other hand, Plato and in the Bhagavad Gita, there is a presumption that there is something eternal about the human being. That is, that there is some aspect of us that death cannot touch. That is an eternal part of us, an immortal part of us. And that is a very deep divide in terms of a theory of death, a fundamental conception of death between, let's call it Epicurus's annihilationism, the idea that we are annihilated, and the immortalism that is expressed by Plato or Socrates in the Phaedo and the Bhagavad Gita. A very deep divide, I think. And perhaps the deepest divide that separates people in their conception of death, whether they think that death is the absolute end and there's nothing left over of the human being after death, or whether they believe that there is something which survives, that whether they believe that there is some fate of some part of themselves that continues, some destiny that continues after what we call death. And that is a very deep divide. But one of the things that's interesting, if you look at those two theories, at least as they are expressed in the last readings, is that the conclusion from all parties, Epicurus, Plato, the Bhagavad Gita, is that death is not something to be feared. I almost said that death is no big deal. Well, it doesn't quite apply to Plato for various reasons, I think, but that death is not the horrible or dreadful event that we normally think of it as, that in some ways it is nothing, because it's just a moment that either ends all feeling and perception and awareness, or it's a moment that signals the beginning of something else. In any case, it's not something to be feared, or something about which we should feel any anxiety, really, if we think the question through. These readings that I've given you to look at in section 3 take a different approach. That is, and you might say that the central theme there is this idea from the 20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger, that human existence itself, that is our being, what it means to be a human being, is a being towards death. I think that if you look at the scene that I've given you from the 1980 film My Dinner with Andre, in which Wally and Andre discuss this matter, and Wally brings up Heidegger. That's a pretty good explanation, I think. And Wallace Shawn, an actor and playwright and political activist, he's very good at explaining philosophical ideas in ordinary language, and I think a lot can be gained from listening to that sort of thing. You know, his notion, in talking with his friend Andre, having dinner, that if you were really alone with yourself, and you weren't distracted by any of the day-to-day cares that we fill our lives with, but we were just sort of alone quietly with ourselves, that what we would experience is the movement towards our own death. The way that a human life is always on the path of its own ending, or towards its own ending, its own finitude. And I think that if we fill it out a little bit with Simon Critchley's essay on Heidegger that I've given you, that that end, that death, has to be an absolute end. That is, it's a being towards nothingness. It's not just a being towards death as that sort of moment that John Donne or the Bhagavad Gita or Plato would conceive of it, of the separation of the self from the body, or the soul from the body, to really be felt in its entirety, in the way I think Heidegger means that we need to feel it and experience it and accept it, is a being towards nothingness. That is an experience of our own finitude, falling out of the world, you might say, in this complete and utter way. And the claim there on the part of Heidegger and perhaps other existentialists is that in order to live a really authentic life, what is sometimes called living in the truth, that you have to have those quiet moments that Wallace Shawn and Andre Gregory talk about, where you realize in a profound way the temporariness of your existence, and that Heidegger believes, or at least his followers believe, that there is a payoff there. That is, that if we accept the finitude of our existence, if we accept that, as another existentialist called it, that every life ends in shipwreck, every life ends in this sort of utter kind of falling out of being, that if we accept that, the finitude of our being, the nothingness that eventually awaits us all, that is a precursor to living a full life in our finitude, in our temporariness, the realization and appreciation of the present moment. And I think that that's something that perhaps doesn't come out in any of the readings there. Heidegger believed, I think, that all we have is the present moment, and so to live in the present is really the goal of every human life. And to live in the present, though, as I think Wallace Shawn explains, is to be open to death. That is, if we were really living in the present and not distracted by our goals or our projects or what's happened before, that to live in the present, to really be open to reality and truth, one might say, is to be open to death. And again, death as our ultimate nothingness, as our ultimate annihilation. I gave you an excerpt from W.H. Auden's poem, Canzone, which is just a part of a poem. I didn't think it was necessary to put the whole poem up, but I think a very powerful expression of a certain feeling which I would associate, I just personally associate with that Heidegger notion of being towards death. Auden says, "We are created from and with the world, to suffer with and from it day by day." That is, we are part of the world. We're created out of the world, and we live with the world, what we consider our world, every day. Whether we meet in a majestic world of solid measurements or a dream world of swans and gold, we are required to love all homeless objects that require a world. And here's the line that really got me, where he said, "Our claim to own our bodies and our world is our catastrophe." That is, we are creatures who naturally form attachments. We become invested in ourselves, in the world. We realize ourselves through a world, and we feel like it's our world. But as he says, our claim to own our bodies, that is, our bodies are ours, and our world is our catastrophe, because at bottom that is not true. We don't own our bodies in the most fundamental sense, or our world. Those are things that are eventually taken away from us through death. I don't think death is ever mentioned in this poem, but I think it's right there in Auden's mind, that we don't really own our bodies. They don't really belong to us, and our world doesn't belong to us. And that's our catastrophe, is that we are invested in the world and love in the world, and that world is eventually taken away from us through death. He continues, "What can we know but panic and caprice, until we know our dreadful appetite demands a world whose order, origin, and purpose will be fluent satisfaction of our will." What can we know but panic and caprice? That is, we become invested in the world, in ourselves, in other people, in projects. The panic and caprice, I believe, is our panic and anxiety that we know that all this will be taken away from us. That however much we love the world and ourselves, that eventually it'll all go away. It doesn't really belong to us. And we have this, what he calls this dreadful appetite, which demands a world whose order, origin, and purpose will be fluent satisfaction of our will. That is, we demand something more. We demand a world that is ours, that we do own, that we do have with some degree of permanence. And that's why I put that there, because I think it leads to the last reading by Paul Landsberg, the experience of death. And let me do one more video in which I just explain why I included that.